We've been hearing and seeing a lot of this in Test cricket of late. In our lifetime, wickets have never fallen this often. There are two current players here who debuted around the same time. One is an all-time great, and the other his own fans were not sure how he got into the side most of the time. This is a look at two splits in their careers. This is how much better or worse they've been in the last 4 years compared to the 5 years previous. You can see that one player has struggled and the other has done well. And almost none of this has to do with their overall skill. It's mostly due to the fact that cricket is currently in a pace-playing pandemic. In 2014, the global batting average was the third highest since 1950. The only two that beat it were 2009 and 2010, which were epically high averages. And for the first 17 years after the year 2000, the average never dipped under 30. Runs were being made, record runs. If you look at the batters with serious runs averaging over 50, a third of them played a huge chunk of their career in this era. This was a very good era to be a very great batter. If you look at the 1970s and 80s, there are 4 batters on this list. Greg Chappell, Jarrod, Sunil Gavaskar and Alan Border. Let's take it back to the 1920s and 30s. There are that many players in the top 10. Don Bradman, Wally Hammond, Jack Hobbs and Herbert Sutcliffe. There is little doubt that the era you bat in massively affects how many great batters you have. And when you look at the years with the highest runs per wicket in cricket, you can see that other than late 1940s, which was war affected, and not even half a decade, the top 4 scoring periods are 1920s and 30s, and then the 2000s and 2010s. So when you play can have a massive impact on your batting average. For instance, Wally Hammond averaged 58.5. The big fella could play. In first class cricket, which in England at that time was probably stronger than most test matches, he scored 50,000 runs with 167 centuries and an average of 56. And he was equally interesting off the field. But Hammond's era and opponents are also telling. He played in the 1920s and 30s and even into those 1940s. That is a good era to be great, as Hammond was. And when you look at Hammond versus each team, you get to understand why so many of these players had great records. Australia and the West Indies were the only teams with solid bowling attacks in his era. And look at his average against them, the 2 lowest. And also, in many ways, the 2 most normal. Hammond was really the person who bodyline or leg theory was first used on by the West Indies. But bodyline was adapted to take on Don Bradman. And no one ever talks about how Bradman tormented a bunch of new and struggling test teams where he averaged 140 against them, and then only 90 against England. Obviously, Bradman would have been pretty good anyway. But if he didn't bat in the 1920s, 30s and 40s again, you wonder if it would have been quite that high. There are other players too, like Herbert Sutcliffe and Kumar Sangakkara, who had near perfect batting eras. Sutcliffe started in the 1920s and finished a decade later in the 30s. And Sangakkara started in 2000 and finished just as the pace-playing pandemic started. That's not to say they weren't great players, because they were head and shoulders above their peers. And also, Sangakkara had to keep some of his. But there's also a reason you find these 2 incredible talents at number 2 and number 8 on the all-time in terms of batting averages. They both would have been over 50 no matter what. But there is a bit of a boost for just getting your era right. And that sucks for current batters. Because right now, batting is tough. I feel like I say this in every video, but the pace-playing pandemic is completely destroying batters in test match cricket. Look at the 2020s. It's currently the 11th best batting decade. The 90s were tough to bat in, and this has been way worse. Only in the 1950s, where literally batters stopped hitting the ball off the square, have we seen anything like this. All the other years are either war affected, when players were learning to bat, or worse still, when the pitches still had hunks of crap on them. Yeah, this was a thing. Enjoy. Let's get straight to the point. Batting in cricket used to be crap. W.G. Grace was so much better than everyone else.
I was the OG.
Yet even in his prime he had years where he averaged 28 and 32. Not because of the bowling, that was fairly basic, but because the pitches were massive turds. And that's largely down to the fact that in order to make them grow, you had to sprinkle little bits of cow poop on them. So when overarm bowling finally won over the MCC, the ball would seam around off little chunks of dookie. You can see why that was a problem. But when machines like muck spreaders came along, we had liquid turds, which would grow the grass without spoiling a good length. It's hard to give an exact date when dung went juicy, but by 1898 it was used in places as far-fetched as Launceston. So clearly the idea, much like the substance itself, had spread quickly.
Oh, poop.
It wasn't all smooth sailing for the magic number 2. The MCC sent out a circular saying that it was ruining cricket. Of course it was. It was that point that cricket went from a bowler's game to one for the batsman. But think about it this way. Our pitches used to be shit until our shit got better. Okay, that was a bit full on, but let me show you one really important part from that we sort of scooted by. In the 1850s, a decade before overarm bowling became fully legal, the average run per wicket was around 12. From 1870 to 1900, as muck spreaders, spread around the world, you could see that the batting average doubled. From 1900 onward, it really becomes a batter's game. Before then, it was a bowler's game. Being that the 1910s were a war period, it's really in the 1920s when modern batting starts. So if we take off the shit years and World War I, which were shit years in their own way, as it currently stands, this is the second worst runs per wicket era we have ever seen. Now, we're only 2 years into this decade, albeit we've had more tests than the 1920s and the 1940s in that time. So you would expect that average to go up. But obviously it didn't start magically right at the start of this decade. I first noticed it in 2018. By early 2019, anyone sort of keeping an eye on this had seen what I'd seen. Instantly, the hot takes came in that Ireland and Afghanistan were to blame, despite the fact that Ireland's first test actually averaged more than the global average that year, and that India made 400 against Afghanistan. After that, it was T20, as if the delayed effects of that format had suddenly kicked in on batters, despite the fact that T20 was a pretty serious thing for a long time as everyone made a lot of runs. And also, ODI cricket had been blamed for that in the 90s. And with 2 formats of white ball cricket existing, batting actually reached its equal highest peak. And all while these arguments and discussions were being had, not even to mention the important one of whether the whole thing was a blip. We hadn't even really noticed the main problem at this point. Yes, teams were making fewer runs, but not against everything. Let's look at 2 key periods, 2012 to 2017 first. This is at the end of the high batting era. And as you can see, as is normally the case, pace has a slight edge on spin bowling when it comes to bowling. But both are quite high, strong batting numbers, really. This is a good point in the history of the game to be a batter. So let's throw that together with 2018 until now. Spin has only dropped marginally, but basically stayed the same. Pace looks more like an NFT owner's wallet after someone steals their monkey. That is a 5.5 run drop, 18%. Huge, and it's been going on for quite a while now. If you just look at pace bowling, we have actually had these issues before. Obviously, as I said before, we have to overlook a lot of the first part of Test cricket. In many ways, we didn't really have proper seam bowlers anyway. In fact, most bowlers back then were hybrids. They're often called spinners or seamers interchangeably. But as the years go on, you can see that first real dip around the 1950s. And there's another one in the late 70s, early 80s. When I wonder if the combination of Kerry Packer's World Series, Pakistan's reverse swing, and the West Indies assembling their bowling attack had anything to do with that. And we have had the odd low year, that's natural and normal, but nothing like we've had over the last few years. And again, this year has started off so low. So I have proved that we are, in fact, in a pace-playing pandemic. But now, why? Well, I don't think there's any one reason. I do know of a rumour that many board CEOs around the world were discussing how tests have become, boring, and wanted to spice their surfaces up. But I did ask around, and honestly, I couldn't find much about that. But there was one CEO who's quite vocal about it, Cricket West Indies' Johnny Graves, who brought over Duke's balls from England and turned the wickets from low, slow, terrible surfaces into great viewing. Well, great viewing if you want to see a lot of seam wickets. This is the percentage drop of runs per wicket from the previous era to this one. You can see that the West Indies are second on here. India has been a great place to play seam historically, but the arse has fallen out of batting versus pace in that country. But the bigger news is that over 6 nations have had a 20% drop, and only Zimbabwe, which is more or less the same, New Zealand, which is exactly the same, and Sri Lanka, who've actually gone the other way, are different. New Zealand and West Indies might be the most relevant here, as we know that the West Indies tried to spice up their pitches, and we also know that New Zealand tried to make them better for batting. Job done. But something else weird happened. In January of 2018, 2 test pitches were rated poor by the ICC. One was the MCG because it was flat and shit and everyone watching the cricket wanting to die. And the Wanderers because the bounce was uneven and the batters out there almost died. Since 2010, we've had 6 pitches given poor ratings. Of this list, weirdly enough, I was at number 1, 2 and 4, and I watched number 5 on TV. I honestly wonder if Pune and Gaul would actually still be penalised now, especially as there seems to be far less bias against spinning pitches in the ICC's fines of late. And that Nagpur pitch wasn't even the worst pitch I've seen at Nagpur. But I still think a pitch as big and important as the MCG one is, when it's fined, would have a bit of a ripple effect around cricket. Especially because it was fined because it was too much in the favour of batters, not bowlers. But regardless of that, I just can't see how the MCG pitch is so important that it changed the way that all ground staff around the world prepare their surfaces. And while yes, there is a rumour about the CEOs all coming together, I really think it's doubtful that it's anything more than a couple of them chatting in a Dubai hotel bar at the end of a long day. The other reason pitches could be more fun now is that teams are rigging them for the World Test Championship. And the ICC were aware that there was a greater potential for extreme pitches arising from the WTC. The only thing is that didn't start until mid-2019, and the slide was well and truly on its way by then. If pitches are more favourable to bowlers, and they certainly look like they are to me, it could just be a coincidence that a lot of places did that at once. Or it could just be that many boards worked out that people don't really remember flat batting tests as much, and 40 wickets work really well on social media. And there was actually a bigger change to cricket than the pitches that has been maybe underreported in cricket. Kookaburra fixed their ball, and for years the Kookaburra was a pretty ordinary object. Not only did it fall out of shape easily, it was really quite pointless bowling scene with it after a certain point. But now we're on to Kookaburra 2.0. And there is no doubt that this ball has played a small part in the change. But again, I'm sad to say that this new ball of Kookaburras was actually being trialled in 2018 and 2019. Didn't actually make it onto the test arena until 2020, where it, to be fair, has done a lot of damage. But what about when that ball wobbles? The wobble or scrambled seam ball has certainly had a huge impact on the game of cricket. And I certainly couldn't go to all the different reasons why it is completely changing the way that test players play. But what I will say is this ball is moving like wildfire through our game. When bowled at 85, 90, 95 miles an hour, and you and the bowler are not particularly sure what it's going to do until the ball is pitched, I mean, good luck. And it was actually around before 2018. There is no doubt that this ball has played a small role in the global drop. But there's no real way to calculate that because we don't even know which balls are wobbleable and which balls aren't, without going back and looking at all of them. And I suppose we do need to talk about T20, because that will be the obvious culprit that many people will point to for no one making runs in Test cricket anymore. But let's Fermi paradox this one. Why isn't T20 ruining bowlers and batters facing spin? Like, I get it, people are quick to blame T20, and it's a huge innovation that is suffocating and growing the sport simultaneously. But why would it only ruin batters playing pace bowling and nothing else? Surely bowlers who are losing confidence by getting slogged and only bowling 4 overs and who spend half their time bowling wide filth or dirty slow ball should also be getting ruined. And also, I showed you the thing with spin before. Spin hasn't dropped off, right? So all those people slugging spin with bad techniques in T20 are doing fine in Test cricket. The other thing is, if T20 was really affecting batters, wouldn't we also see that through them attacking so much? And I assume we'd notice that. In fact, the early 2000s were a very fast-scoring era. Batting actually slowed down as T20 took over. That's probably a combination of teams using sweepers more and the slight regression in average, but either way, I really fail to see this reckless batting that everyone's talking about. In fact, it's probably more notable that the real change in terms of averages and scoring rates comes before the T20 movement, and that seems to be from ODIs, the same ODIs that in the 90s were allegedly ruining Test batting, and actually either had the opposite effect or none at all. So if T20 has had an effect, and I think it would have to have an effect somehow on Test cricket, I really don't see it playing a big role in the pace-playing pandemic. In fact, there are plenty of slow batters around still, and they're struggling just as much as everyone else. This is all the Test batters with over 500 runs in this fallow period. And the Blues are the ones who play a lot of T20 cricket, and the Reds are the Test specialists or just don't play that much T20. If T20 had burnt out all these batters, I'd expect far more red dots past here. You can shun franchise cricket all you want and become a Test specialist, but it's still going to be hard to score any runs against that red ball at the moment. But regardless of T20, cricket has changed. And part of this is just the game moving forward. And also part of this is from analysis and professionalism from inside T20. Hell, we now know which side of the wicket left-handers prefer to be bowled at from. In fact, here's a little bit from a video I did on this 2 years ago. Right armers now bowl around the wicket to left-handers a lot. When Flintoff came around the wicket to Adam Gilchrist, it was a novelty. Before that, unless a batsman was known to have a weakness with bowling around the wicket, a right-arm bowler might come around, but it was rarely the first thing you tried. Bowling around the wicket was seen as a second choice, sometimes a third choice, often when the ball was older and the batsman was well set. But over the last few years, it's become fashionable, like woolen shoes and becoming a health golf. Recently in tests, right-arm bowlers have delivered 40% of their balls from around the wicket to left-handers. Before that, it was 21%. Let me help on the maths. It's basically double. The point is, we know a lot about batters, and that seems to help bowlers. And as far as I can tell, we haven't had a big analysis boom that helps the batters anywhere near as much. In fact, most of the analysis really only helps seam bowlers over spinners as well. So a seamer in modern cricket goes into each match with an advantage over a batter. In white ball cricket, the pitches, fielding restrictions, and the rubbish white ball itself negate that. In red ball cricket, these things are a huge advantage that older bowlers didn't have. There is a big difference from having Glenn McGrath's memory and Jimmy Anderson being able to see every single full in-swinger that Dimuth Karunaratne has ever faced while laying on his hotel bed. Then there's DRS, which at first started to hurt fast bowlers when all their dodgy LBs rightfully went to spinners who had been ripped off for generations. Reacting to that has been a long road for the seamers, but there's little doubt now that they're pitching the ball up more. In the year 2020, it was actually back to the sorts of levels we'd seen before the umpires had worked out that the ball usually bounces more than they thought. In fact, if you look at them all together, you realise that that year was the first year since the change when seamers took a higher percentage of wickets of LBWs than spinners did. And there are two ways I'm going to show you this. The first is from my video on Ishant Sharma, where you can see him dragging his length fuller and fuller as his career goes on and getting a lot more success.
But Ishant's lengths have changed. Before 2017, he didn't bowl what we classify as a good length for seamers that often, and now he does. He was a bouncer and back of a length and Yorker bowler, and now he's a length bowler. And certainly I would never tell your uncle, but the fuller Ishant has bowled, the better he has become. I mean, the truth is right here.
And then there's the TV companies who have changed their good length. Traditionally, they say a good length is between 6 and 8 meters. And you can kind of see that on this first graph. And as you can kind of see on Fox's graph here, that is moving to 5 and 7 meters. That's because bowlers and analysts have worked out that the 6 meter length keeps LBW and bowled in play. But it's also easier to do if the pitches aren't flat as hell. The Kookaburra actually works, and the wobble ball is taking everyone down. So with all that more information, it's also changing the training techniques and the understanding of what it is to be a professional. Before, bowlers would deliver over or around based on their preferences, or deliver whatever their natural length was. Now a team's plans are based on research. If you can't bowl around the wicket or slightly fuller because that's where the batter's weakness is, then you're going to be trained how to do that by experts who can help. Bowlers just don't do what they're good at anymore. They're constantly tweaking their games because they're more professional now. They're paid to do that. And there's a whole support staff helping them do that. We know we should bowl in certain ways, and we train bowlers to be able to do that when needed. We also just take care of bowlers better. You can laugh at rest and rotations, but fit bowlers are better than banged up ones. Sure, some will be able to perform through it, but understanding workloads and how to better train, exercise and feed bowlers is an important thing. So all these things, analysis, wobble ball, the new Kookaburra, spicy pitches and training all help. But you're probably sitting there going, what if the bowlers are just better now? And I mean, this current crop is tasty as hell. Kagiso Rabada, Trent Bolt, Kemar Roach, Jasprit Bumrah, Pat Cummins, Shaheen Afridi. There's some names there, right? And we know with a team like India that they have their best all-time pace bowling lineup right now, and probably even their best backups available right now. I mean, they've just never had this many bowlers of this speed. They also have 3 seamers who bowled a lot in the period before, and a lot during the pace-playing pandemic. And of course, it's not just Indian bowlers. I found 23 bowlers with 20 wickets before or after this period. And I found 3 of those were better in that previous period. One is Dale Steyn, who obviously was coming to the end of his career physically. Another was Colin de Grandhomme, a medium pace change bowler really, as much as anything. And the third was Mohammad Abbas, who's only 2 runs a wicket worse, so not really a big deal. And then we have a bunch of bowlers who are basically exactly the same. And then we have the other end here. From Anderson and Flander, who took a scalpel and just lobbed a little bit off their average, through to Sarunga Luckmell and Jason Holder, who took a chainsaw to their mark. So 2 bowlers were 2.5 runs worse than before, and 14 were 2.5 runs better than before. Remember those Indian guys? They've all taken big whopping chunks off their averages. This isn't captaincy or a bunch of players just all developing at the same time. Something has changed in world cricket. Well, a lot of things have changed in world cricket and have made this happen. Wickets are just falling really quickly to quicks. There is no one reason, just a lot of small reasons. Oh, and to go back to that graph at the start, let's put some faces on it. I mean, this is the era of Sarunga Luckmell and not the era of Virat Kohli. There is no doubt that Kohli is better at what he does. But because of the conditions and everything that's coming together nicely, Luckmell and the rest of the seamers are just dominating. Currently, Pat Cummins has a test bowling average of 21.19. Of the men with more wickets than him, only 5 have better records. And he played only 9 tests before 2018 due to injury. He's played 29 since. Guess which one he averages under 20 in. There are 36 bowlers, seam and spin, with 50 wickets in this pace bowling pandemic. 19 of these bowlers average under 25, and 1 is a spinner. No specialist pace bowler has taken 50 wickets in that time with an average of over 30.
I mean, you can see it. Pace bowlers are at one end, spinners are at the other. This is incredible.
It seems for modern batters, life comes at you pretty fast. It's been rough out there for the batters, and the game has changed. Of course, in some ways, it's still the same. The game of Test cricket is still the sound of leather on willow. It's just that, in between, there's just a lot of...
Under square on the fence, oh, he's knocked him over.
Line again to Pope. Oh, and he's bowled in.
And he bowled in now. That's a brilliant comeback.